because everyone else there won't have the benefit of seeing all the results. Does anyone else want to make a comment at this point? John and Enda from the two other breakout rooms, were ye happy that you had concluded and had started the poll as well? Had it run as smooth as ours did?
Yes, Porrick. Well, I don't know how smoothly yours ran, but
that was amazing.
Yeah. We got through all of the content. Thank you very much. So we're ready to give our feedback.
Great. And John?
Yeah, I think it worked well anyway. It didn't appear on the screen, but we still were able to give the details anyway. So it's kind of in line with what we were thinking anyway. The COVID support, skills enhancements, etc., kind of came up in the kind of consultations earlier.
Yeah. Well, we'll go through all of that now in a few moments. I mean, I must admit we had to race through the ESF side of the table because we got quite engaged in discussion on the Rdf to great value, I must add. But right, I think it's fair to say that all the votes are in, and we'll just spend a moment just having a quick look at them. I know there are some messages coming in now, which I won't read for a few minutes if that's okay, but maybe somebody else could have a quick look at them in case there's anything that needs to be dealt with immediately. But what I shall do now is take a look at the first question. Okay, here we go. So, and like I say, this isn't in any way scientific. There are 62 participants, but it probably helps us put some, I suppose, numbers on the discussion that we just had in the regional rooms. So on the Rdf side, considering the 5 relevant needs or priorities addressed in the needs analysis, climate action measures clearly have just shaved it there in terms of their relevance as a priority. But smart regions, innovation districts, and regional disparities, they're all neck and neck. So I guess it would suggest that there's a lot of relevance in the needs that we have identified from the Indicon report, and that they're in equal measure to some degree. R&D, I know that in our own group, we'll talk about that in a few moments, and also that maybe point 2 and 3 are very closely linked together. Not many are saying other things, which is always useful, or else it might be that the conclusion is we missed major areas. I'll go to the next question now, and then we'll start to share our views more generally. Okay, so the same question was posed for ESF related activity and the priorities. And again, number 1 and 2, the COVID response is so critical, I guess. And I'm sure we'll spend quite a bit of the time now talking about that as well. You can see the results there. Nothing seems to be irrelevant or of a lower importance, and I think that's an important conclusion to this. Okay, so that doesn't need to be analysed any further, I don't think. I'd like to just invite any comments just before we start to share and feedback to one another. Is there anything that needs addressing at this point? Is there anyone at the controls that needs to draw any attention to? I'm just going to have a quick look at the comments. Okay,
I think you can move along.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I agree. Yeah. Will I start the feedback process, or John or Enda? Do you feel you want to go first?
Yeah, I can come in. Yeah, I suppose on the Rdf side, I suppose some of the main kind of things, and some of our colleagues can correct me anyway if I've left anything out. But in terms of the Rdf priorities, R&D came up big in our breakaway room, and since that, a lot of support is needed for SMEs in particular. Kind of, there was maybe a reliance on multinational companies, and maybe as highlighted in the European Commission's country report, there's a need to support SMEs, and that should be a big factor in the ERDF side, and that would fall under obviously the need identified by Indicon. Again, as well, collaboration with SMEs and higher education institutes in this regard, any supports that would kind of facilitate, greater collaboration between Indigenous SMEs and kind of our higher education institutes, facilitate research and development. And again, that goes into the overall theme of just kind of the importance of enterprise development, and as well as that, kind of take whether we can use the funds, maybe need RDF sense to maybe utilize the kind of trend to remote working, but maybe kind of the co-working, maybe our enterprise hubs that would maybe allow to build on that kind of trend. And again, as you mentioned, you saw on the poll, the climate action side, the climate action measures, of retrofitting and wind energy very much came to the fore as well. So that's, I suppose, kind of the summary of our kind of the feedback from our room anyway. Unless anyone else wants to come in that regard, if I've left anything out in our group, but I think that kind of takes it as much to account as possible from our side anyway.
Thank you, John. And also we have some commentary running all the time as well in the chat box and the question functions there. So we're doing our best, I suppose, to facilitate answers. But thanks very much for that, John. Enda, you're in the other room. How was that? Yeah.
So the votes in the southern region. So look, I suppose the composition of our room was predominantly focused on ERDF, but we did get to ESF as well. Just going through the 1 to 5 under the ERDF side of things. On regional disparities, a few issues were touched on. One was concern maybe that some of the organisations that most needed funding may not have the administrative capacity to draw down on that funding, and that some of the solutions that we think of and that are included in the programme need to try and address that challenge. And there was a contribution later that was offered one solution, which I'll come to. It was stressed, really, the contribution stressed the importance of the national planning framework and how critical it is to addressing regional disparity, and obviously the national planning framework then feeding into the RESIS. And there was an observation that there may be a low level of understanding among the general public, including some policymakers and organisations that will be involved in the funding programmes. There needs to be that understanding more about how the national planning frameworks and the RESIS and the development plans that come from those can address regional disparities and set the context for addressing regional disparities. And certainly the Regional Assembly's contributions in the room agreed the importance of that. And
you put that away here and have your lunch.
Okay. Hard to compete with that. The Regional Assemblies agreed the importance, and basically that there continues to be a job of work to I suppose to educate, and today's session is part of that job of work. And as the RESIS go into implementation phase, there'll continue to be this engagement with the public and with organisations involved in implementing the RESIS objectives. There was an observation really about the tendency in Ireland that we've tended to go it alone over previous OPs, that we're not typically using the European models that are predominant in Europe, and that in that sense we're missing out. So we make very little use of open calls. We're not using integrated territorial investments. We're not using financial instruments. limited use of smart specialization, and that you know, this really is an opportunity to address this in the design of the next OPs. I suppose it was stressed the importance of placemaking and the importance of a bottom-up approach, and that this would seem to be absent in previous OPs, was one of the observations. Just to finish off on that particular theme, just bear with me. Yeah, just I suppose the importance of connecting with other funds, that there would seem to be a disconnect with other funds, and that it's really important that these funds, I suppose ERDF and ERDF, ESF plus and ERDF, but also other funds are taken into consideration. Just moving on then to the R&D expenditure. Look, we came back again to the administrative. That this is key, that if we're trying to get small enterprises, SMEs involved, then the admin burden is key. So, you know, there was mention of the innovation vouchers, which are national exchequer funded rather than ERDF funded, but that type of model works, and to look to see how it could be used to a greater extent in the future. I'm going to name check. I generally haven't name checked people, but I think, Gary, you won't mind if I name check you. Gary Ryan in UL is involved in work around developing a cluster or a network in the area of sports and sports research, and, you know, made the contribution that clusters and networks could provide a solution to capacity building, that they can help SMEs and micro enterprises in particular access funding, whether it's ERDF funding or other EU funding, or even indeed business funding, and that there's a downstream effect then on some of the other issues that are have to be addressed, like social inclusion, if these clusters can be made to work. We touched on the idea of smart regions and districts, and there was a suggestion that, you know, this use of this idea of smart regions and districts can include the smart villages and rural areas as well. And on climate action measures, definitely there was, you know, a continued emphasis on retrofitting, but that it's not just about funding. It's very important to support independent organizations that can help end users, that can show them the benefits and that can help them through the process of accessing the funding and, I suppose, implementing the solutions. So whether that be energy agencies or similar bodies. There was one contribution around the area of sustainable transport. This is arising from a project that was funded through Interreg Europe, which looks at, it's effectively an implementation tool for towns in the region to assess their capacity to support, I think that a 10-minute tool, it was called, to look at accessibility to that town and also connectivity to that town. And really it was given as an example of cross-cutting from ERDF and ESF. Okay, just then touching on ESF activities, as I say, there was a lower number of people involved, but, you know, that Menti poll that you showed probably reflected the emphasis in our group as well. There was a contribution around, you know, when we're thinking of solutions, an example might be the skills building for energy efficiency measures, that we need to think about gender and how do we design responses, say, to the COVID labour market measures that provide gender equality, that don't focus on solutions for one particular gender, and widening that don't discriminate against other groups. So you know, that social inclusion is key. There was a general, I suppose there was a contribution looking at, say, you know, does ESF have a role to play in the cultural sector, which has been very badly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that there may be a role for ESF to tackle both, you know, labour market support measures for the cultural sector, and at the same time that could address some of the other specific objectives, for example, combating poverty among children. But that that contribution in the cultural sector could be taken to other areas of other sectors that are particularly badly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, on ESF, it was mentioned that the RESIS, certainly in our region, includes the concept of learning cities, and that ESF plus funding may support implementation in that area. So that's something for the designers of the OP to consider. I think that's it from the Southern region.
Very good, and thank you, Enda. Interestingly, from John and Enda's feedback there, I can say there was a lot of similarities within our own, the Northern and Western region. And so rather than going back over all the same points that we would have covered, I'll just make some general comments and then pick out on a few things that were quite unique or specific. I mean, I guess, again, the ERDF, after hearing a presentation on the regional spatial and economic strategy, it does provide an element of a spatial focus. So people are thinking about the change that might happen on the ground, so to speak. So ERDF and point one in particular, the regional disparities, did get a good airing. There was a point, in fact, about maybe the spatial dimension where Galway in particular had a much stronger kind of sense of participation in the objectives or the outcomes, particularly around things like R&D expenditure, and that vast areas of the region probably hadn't the capacity or the experience of addressing that particular area of R&D expenditure. And it was, mentioned a number of times that there was a hope that the future program would encourage more SMEs to participate as opposed to very much multinational led. Again, the business of the open calls and maybe not utilising capital funds from Europe as well as other countries was also highlighted in our group, and there was a number mentioned as well in that context. So that's interesting that came up. Things like smart specialization policy could be funded better by a more creative and innovative use of separate funds from within Europe. The state aid levels was questioned as well. Too low for participation, or to at least be an incentive to encourage industry, particularly to get involved in certain types of activities. So it's a technical point. It's something that they, I suppose, the operational programs and the partnership agreement will look at. If there are barriers, can they be addressed? And that might be one of them. There was quite a bit of time spent, as I say, talking about the second and third point, and sometimes on the ERDF side, in almost as if they were one outcome area. But that's not to say that climate action measures and the development of smart regions, as in both of the other rooms, seem to come out strongly. We did spend some time talking about cross-cutting activities as well, and sports came up as a point that uniquely, maybe not uniquely, but very strongly addresses both infrastructure, capital type activity, or structural activity, and then also the social skills development and pure ESF related funding, and that we should look more at those types of areas of society and our economies as creative ways of addressing both the RDF and ESF funds. There were some comments about the cross-border nature of our region as well, particularly the A5 being an absolutely critical project for the cross-border development and mobility factor, particularly in the context of a bad Brexit happening. So that is just something that's probably unique to our region, in that there's so much cross-border activity Conall kindly gave us in the presentation at the beginning an insight into the cross-border collaboration and the work around the Northwest City region, as well as some of the specifics of the RSES. Broadband came up, as you expect, particularly in the context of rural and the digital recovery, and our ability to fight our way out of the COVID situation right now has rapidly thrust us into a digital world. And, you know, without the broadband, I mean, we're simply, you know, just going around in circles, and that's going to have to be addressed. Now, while it was acknowledged that the National Broadband Plan and even things like BCPs being provided, they're the broadband connection points identified in rural broadband intervention areas, that there might be scope for EU funding to actually look at least even pilots to deliver broadband in very localized areas where there's an urgent need. Carer support, a major point on the ESF discussion, and that's for health and social carers. And I think we'd all probably acknowledge, after the experience that we've seen about frontline workers and those exposed probably to tackling COVID, that there needs to be a lot of investment and priority given to our ability to support the people at the front line. There was also an interesting comment about ESF being an enabler as opposed to just responding to the transitioning of skills and addressing actual priorities like combating poverty and so on. So almost to put it on its head a little bit, that the investment function is an economic enabler. I think they were the main the main points that came from our group that were maybe somewhat different from the other groups. If anyone from my group, which was the Northern and Western Regional Assembly, wants to throw in another point or two, I'm more than happy to be corrected. So we're now at 12:42, and I suppose I'd like to invite any further comments on you know, the line of inquiry today. I mean, there are a number of questions being asked as we went along. Maybe it might be time to ask Ben and Luke if there are anything that they feel they want to share at this stage, or they may be in response. It might be an appropriate time to answer specific questions that have been asked that maybe we all didn't see. Is there any?
Pádraig, nothing further from my side.
Okay, cool. And I think you've done a great job actually of addressing all the questions that did come earlier. So, I mean, I would just be looking to ask, are there more questions that we can now spend minutes resolving or attempting to resolve before we start to move towards closing the event? Is there any contributions from the floor there? It doesn't need to be, but that's okay. I might use this opportunity just to say as well that the ESIF website is where you'll find all the information relating to this public consultation. So this is just one part of the overall process. So the survey and the submissions function is in there on the website, and that's open until the 4th of September. So that's something I just want to remind people of. And I know that Anne-Marie did that at the very beginning. Ben and Luke and all our contributors have mentioned it. So please, we expect to see a lot of submissions following from today. I'm just going to briefly read a comment here. That's okay. So, have we given it enough airing? We're on 12:45, which was the time that we said we would go to the closing remarks. Is there any last comment?
I think you can work away, Pádraig. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Enda. Okay, so without further ado, I'll invite Mary McGarry now from the ESF Managing Authority to close the event. And I'd like to thank you all very much for all your contributions and patience today. And I feel it's been a very good event, and I'm looking forward to talking with my colleagues afterwards about how it went. So all the best, and thank you very much. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Pádraig, and I'd just like to say thank you to all the participants at this morning's webinar. I was in the Northwestern breakout room, and for me, I think the takeaway thing was comments in relation to the need to tailor our responses for the regions, having regard to the regional particular interests and the tendency to have national programs adjusted into regions, which was an interesting comment and something that I think we can look at. But I suppose just in closing the event, to thank you all, and particularly to thank my own colleagues in Deeper and the regional assemblies, and especially Barry and Nicola for their work on the website, to urge you to make a contribution, respond to the survey or submit a written submission. It's open until the 4th of September, as has been said before. This isn't your final opportunity. We will be working over the coming months to develop and finalise the partnership agreement and the operational programmes, and you will all have a chance to contribute again when we have drafts at that stage before final government approval and submission. So I don't want to delay you any further than to say thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I think we can... I think we can call it a closed event now. So thank you again for your contribution. And like I say, the ESIF website is where you'll find all the information and the place where you can make your submissions. So thanks very much to everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.